Hi, I'm Bri Allison with the Power of the Patient Project, and welcome to our new segment, Tell Us Your Story. Today we are joined by Mrs. Amy Taklif. Mrs. Taklif is a wife, mother, and social worker who has been involved in the disability community for over 30 years. She has a passion for bringing awareness to people with disabilities and strongly advocates for them, especially in medical situations. Mrs. Taklif became even more involved with people with disabilities when she was diagnosed with relapsing-remitting MS in November of 2009. Her prior knowledge and work has helped her understand her own disability and not fear it. Today, she is here to share her story. Mrs. Tackliff, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
So, can you start by explaining what MS is?
Yeah, MS stands for multiple sclerosis. It is a autoimmune condition, which means that your immune system is attacking your own tissues and destroying them or impairing them. There's a number of autoimmune conditions. There's a lot of them actually, but MS is one of the more common ones, although it is also can be one of the more debilitating ones, depending on the type you have and how things go for you. But it's it's an autoimmune condition, so many of the treatments are kind of just entirely suppressing your immune system. I always like to say too that MS is considered a snowflake disease, they call it, and not in the political some snowflake term. Let's not get crazy. They say that because it's everybody's different, similar to things like brain injury, where no two brain injuries look alike. Very much the same with MS. No two people with MS will look the same, will have the same symptoms, although MS and most autoimmune conditions actually occur much more often in women. So it does skew heavily towards women for MS. And there
Oh, I
are
didn't know
actually,
that.
yeah, 80%, 75 or 80% of people with
Wow.
MS are women, although when men get it, it does tend to be worse faster. They tend to become progressive or start out as progressively, because there's different forms of MS. The MS that most people are familiar with is called relapsing-remitting MS, which is what I have. It means that
Mm-hmm.
it comes, you always have it, and you always have this kind of baseline, but then you'll have a relapse where you'll get worse, and maybe your functioning kind of goes down here, and maybe it comes all the way back up, or maybe it never quite does, and then this is your new plateau, and then you're here until the next relapse where you may or may not come all the way back up and move along. But when you have progressive MS, which you can either be diagnosed with right away, or it can be relapsing remitting MS can sometimes turn into progressive MS. Once that happens, instead of seeing these ups and downs, you see a pretty slow decline, which is why they
Mm-hmm.
consider it progressive.
Hmm. And so, what led up to your specific diagnosis, and how did you process finding out that you had MS?
Yeah, I mean, I think like many people with MS, my diagnosis wasn't easy. MS is a condition that, first of all, because it does affect women more, women in healthcare, we do tend to be dismissed, and that your conditions are like, oh, you're just stressed, like, oh, it's fine, you're don't worry about it, like, oh, maybe you're premenopausal, or maybe you're that, like it's always a
Mm-hmm.
million different reasons that they come up with, that it could be. But I was diagnosed officially in 2009, because I'd had a very, very severe headache, thought I was having a stroke. But I'm going to say that, like many people with MS prior to this, I'd had a lot of things that nobody could explain. So when I was 16, I had a bout of encephalopathy. I'm sorry, encephalitis. And after that, I started having these kind of, these times where I would feel like I couldn't speak well, like my hands didn't work well, I was off balance. And because I was young, I was 16, at the time, they're not looking for MS usually that young, even though they did an MRI and it did show some little little plaques in my brain. They said, well, it's probably related to some migraines that I had. And they never really caught it. And in fact, two of the doctors that I saw when I was young had written in my records that I was either malingering or feigning my illness in some way. Oh, she just broke up with her boyfriend. She's 16, she's 17, and they just kind of let it go. Over the years, I would have these kind of attacks, but nobody really could tell me what they were. So I may have had it as young as 16, which is unusual. It's usually diagnosed in your early 20s through to your early 40s. But yeah, for me, many people have that problem. Many people were told either they're crazy or they have something else, or it's a difficult disease because sometimes many of the main condition, the main symptoms of the condition, almost 80% of people experience fatigue as one of the main, like a debilitating, kind of fatigue. And that can be written off as, oh, she doesn't want to work. Oh, he doesn't want to do this. And it can be pain, it can be visual problems. There's so many different things with MS because it really is an autoimmune condition of your brain and your spinal cord. They control everything. So pretty much almost anything could be related to MS. And so my diagnosis, once they did diagnose me and they did a spinal tap, I began medications and such at that point. But as to how I processed it, I had worked for many years with people with disabilities. One of my best friends, still my best friend, growing up in high school, has a brain injury and just has like a left-sided, weakness when he walks. And I came up, knowing people with disabilities, and I think that helped me in some ways because I already knew some great people who had different kinds of medical conditions, but it also hindered me in that I also knew how bad it could get. I had worked with a few people with MS. I had a good friend in college that had MS, and I knew I'd seen the gamut. I'd seen people who had really relatively mild symptoms, maybe even for decades, and it wasn't that really big much of a thing. And then I'd had a friend that was diagnosed and within a year had died of secondary conditions related to MS. So it can be so it can run the gamut. So I think that got stuck in my head for a while, that which side of this am I going to come out on and when, in processing it. One of the more difficult aspects of MS is that because it comes and goes, it's hard to know when you're going to have a good day or a bad day. It's hard to make plans. I always say I am reluctantly unreliable. Like I want to be there, like I plan to be there, but sometimes it just doesn't work out that way. And you have to allow yourself the grace for that, to it's something that, so yeah, and working through and processing it was not as hard for me as it might have been for some people, because while I did know how bad it could get, I also knew that even if I did become very severely physically disabled, that didn't have to, mean that my life is over. I knew so many people with severe disabilities that I knew that you can live a good life like that. It doesn't mean less than disability. So I got to skip that whole part of the journey that so many people have. So you have to go through the, oh no, I have to use a cane. What am I going to do? I'll look disabled. Who cares what you look like? Like, you're safe. Just,
Mhm.
yeah.
Well, that's great. I mean, it's good that not that you compared your journey to other people, but like you said, that you got to see both sides of it. So it was like you remained hopeful in the fact that, like, oh, my journey might go a completely different way than this person's journey.
Yeah, and I mean, and I think I have faith that even if it gets bad, I'm still me. It
Mhm.
doesn't change anything really, except now you have to it's another workaround. That's how I look at it. Is I had the pleasure of working for a number of years for the Division of Disability Services, and I worked underneath some people who had very severe physical disabilities, high quadriplegia, spinal cord injury. That was somebody who was my deputy director. It was it was good to, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Oh, you're fine.
And now I lost my train of thought. But yeah, yeah, but it was good. It's working with, having had people, and realizing that you can make a great life with yourself if you have the correct supports in place was huge for me. And that's when I realized that, the people who don't get to have those supports, the people who don't get to have in-home care or your PCAs to help them get out of bed or to get changed and washed, those are the people that are going to end up in nursing homes, and that's where we don't want people to be. Nobody belongs
Hmm.
in there. That's a whole other
Exactly.
conversation. Yeah.
So what are some of the challenges that you face on a daily basis because of your MS, and how do you manage to stay positive, not knowing what each day will bring, like you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to living with MS that are difficult. There's of course the physical stuff. I lose my balance, I have chronic pain, I get headaches. It's difficult. I walk, with a cane when I'm outdoors. I have some cognitive issues. There's all of these medical things that you have to learn kind of to work around, and compensate for. And that, of course, it is what I think most people think of when they think of, oh, it must be so challenging, for you as a person with a condition. But the reality is, I mean, yes, that's difficult. But what's more difficult is the social side of having a disability, and either having to answer for yourself, like, what are you doing using that, handicap sticker? You're young, you don't look like you need, or whether it's just having to explain to somebody, like, well, this is why I have to, park closer, or I have to, take breaks, or, it's difficult to have people who think they know. So it's actually an inside joke in the chronic illness communities. Like, if you look in the mirror and you clap 3 times, somebody will, and say you have MS, somebody will jump up behind you and tell you to eat some kale. Like, it's just, people just give you unsolicited advice. Like, what, my sister stopped drinking Diet Coke and she was cured. Well, really? Because then she didn't really have MS, did she? Like, you know, clearly that was not her problem. It's such a misunderstood condition. And like I said, because it comes and goes, it's not only frustrating for the person who has it, but it can lead to people being kind of short with you, or thinking like you don't want to be with them because you keep canceling, or well, if all you have to do is just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and that you can do it if you really try. And I think people forget that that term, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, was supposed to be, it was a term for something impossible to do. Why do we make it's like trying to pull yourself up by your bootstraps is what the term used to be in the 1800s, and now it's like you should do that. It's the term for something impossible. So it's also that people always either look at you when you have a disability as an inspiration, like I'm somebody's, look at her, oh, her life must be so terrible, how could she possibly be out, good for you. I love it when I get people who are like, good for you. What are you good for me? I'm in the grocery store. Like, I'm just living my life, man. Why is this? I'm not your inspiration. This is not for you. I don't like that. But I also, I don't like it when people make assumptions based upon what they see. I mean, yes, I look, when I'm sitting down, and like I'm doing great. I'm talking, I'm relatively coherent, at least. People think you're fine, and then they don't understand, well, you're still sick. How could you still be sick? Well, that is what chronic means, ma'am. Like, do you know? Chronic
Hmm.
illness means it doesn't go away. So I think, for me, I mean, yes, there's physical stuff, and I do run the local MS support group. I'm a co-leader of the local group, and we have people whose physical condition runs the gamut. But I always say, it's not, yes, that's difficult to live with, but there's not much you can really do about it. I mean, except be proactive and do the things that you're supposed to do. But what's going to happen is going to happen. It's how you react to it moving forward that's going to make a difference in your life. You can choose to sit there and say, well, this is terrible. And, my kids don't help me as much as they should. And, I feel like, right. And you can, but that's not getting you anywhere. And I, I also have a problem, and I'm sorry if I'm going on here, but
Oh, no, you're fine.
I do. I have a problem too with the trope of the fighter. I'm an MS warrior, or like I fight for me. I have lupus, or whatever. And I think it's for me, and I mean maybe this works for some people, but for me, it's only you're only a warrior if you're making it a fight, and it's not a fight. It's a bodily process. It's literally a chemical process happening to you. It's not a thing. It's not a person. It's not an enemy. It's not even. It's a set of symptoms that medicine has decided that if you have these clump of symptoms, this is what you have. That's all it is, and you're fighting yourself. And when you put yourself in a stance of always fighting, then you're always at a chance of losing. And the reality is there is no cure for this disease, so you're going to lose. I mean, I hate to tell you, like, if the MS doesn't get you, something else is going to get you, but either way, you're going to lose. So I don't like setting it up as a fight, because then you're making it a failure. So when you get worse, you didn't fight hard enough, or when maybe it's not about you didn't do any of this. All you can do is move forward in the best possible way. And it's very difficult to get people out of that headspace where and trying to get them to see also a lot of why me. Well, why not you? You're not special. Like, do you not watch daytime TV? Do you not see that everybody has tragedy? Like, everything happens to everyone. Why not you? And I know this sounds, kind of harsh in some ways, but it's just something that I've come to realize. Like, I'm not special. I could have gone there and said, oh, well, I did everything right. Well, are you saying people who got sick did everything wrong? Are you saying that people who no, of course you're not saying that. So why are you? It's another one of my soapboxes I get on.
No, that's a very interesting perspective because it's something that like I've never thought of because I feel like you just hear it all the time. I
Right.
mean all the different instances that you said.
Yeah.
So it's like what people are used to. So hearing it from
Yeah.
that perspective is, I mean, you make great points.
Yeah. I mean, it's also, I love when people say, well, at least you got your, people say, like, at least I have my health. Well, if you didn't have your health, would you be any less worthy? Like, if you didn't, okay, so, but I don't have my health, but
Mm-hmm.
here I am. Like, it's the stigma of disability in general in this country, and in most countries, to be honest. And people don't realize that, I mean, people with disabilities of all kinds, one in five, there's 1 in 5 people have some kind of a disability. It is the largest minority in the country, in the world, and it is the only minority which anybody can become a member of at any time. And people don't realize that, in the disability community, and I learned this before I had MS when I was working with people with disabilities, they would talk about, just kind of jokingly, like, go call the tab over there. And I'd say, what do you mean a tab? And they say, yeah, a tab. Everybody is a tab. They're temporarily able-bodied. TAB. We're all just temporarily able-bodied. Either you're going to get sick or you're going to get old or you're going to die young. So none of those, all
Mm-hmm.
those things are going to happen. So it's a perspective, of that comes from disability advocacy and disability, a place of power in the disability community. And I think people with MS and anybody who gets kind of adult onset disabilities shies away from that because they feel like, oh, it's people with disabilities. Like, those are the people you feel bad for. And I don't want to be, and so when people get MS and they start coming at you with questions like, well, what do you do when you have drop foot? Or like, what do you do about a tremor? I always say, well, what do other people who have other conditions do with those things? Like, you can ask other people. There's an entire community. Some people have been doing this since the day they were born. There are people who were born with their disabilities who have all the answers for you already that you need. What kind of cushion should I use? Who should I see about a leg brace? Like, they're there. Just nobody wants to use them because
Mm-hmm.
and that's what I got to skip. and being and already having been kind of an honorary part of the disability community.
And that kind of plays in, well, exactly plays into my next question, which was how has your past work with people with disabilities played into your personal diagnosis? So,
Yeah, that was good. That was an excellent
uh-huh.
segue. I've done all kinds of work. So I mean, from the time I was about 16, I did home health care. My mom was a nurse, and she would have me just kind of like, I would sit with a guy who had Alzheimer's. I mean, nothing really big. But then I was hired by an agency, and I did care doing, home health care. I worked in group homes with people who were very severely intellectually disabled, but also had a lot of medical, physical issues. Um, I worked with people with brain injury in doing in-home cognitive rehab. I worked for the Division of Disability Services, where I got to meet people with all kinds of disabilities. I work now for a program in New Jersey that is for kids with medical conditions that helps them pay medical expenses. So, and of course, as I mentioned, my best friend has a brain injury, and one of our best friends in high school also had a spina bifida. So I got to get a little of that disability humor early on too, where you don't take yourself too seriously, and if people think there's something wrong with you, play it up, bang on the table, like make them look at you. you know I never had any kind of that kind of, I got to skip the whole self-pity thing, I think. um yeah, but I think it plays into, now that I have, now that I always say, like, there's that old commercial, I'm not only the hair club president, but I'm also a client. That's how I feel now. It's like I was just, you know, I was just on this side of it, and I was helping people find programs and get them, services, and go to marches, and, doing all kinds of things with disabilities. But I was myself not disabled. And then I was over here, and I'm like, oh, now I see what on this side, because now I can see how, doctors, treat you. I can see how, inaccessible things are, to people. It's just physically, I mean, I always understood the physical inaccessibility, but I mean, how things aren't accessible to people with, cognitive impairments or intellectual disabilities, or, yeah. So, I mean, it definitely informed me in a different way, to have MS. But it's good because it gives me a whole brand new group of people to to talk to about disabilities. And my group is kind of sick of me talking about the disability community and trying to get people involved. But yeah, it definitely has informed a lot of what I do, and having come from that background, and then now having all that background information was helpful for myself, and knowing, oh yeah, I can go get an accessibility evaluation because I know about those. Like, there were things. It really did prep me for being a crip, as some people call it.
Yeah, having you had all that information prior to this, so it definitely, like, you were ahead a little bit. Like, you
Yeah,
were just very prepared.
yeah,
Um,
sure.
and you mentioned in your last answer about the healthcare system and doctors. So how do you feel or think the healthcare system handles people with disabilities?
Yeah, I think I have so much to say on the subject that I'm like, the first thing I always tell people, my group, who are saying, oh, my doctor said this. I always say, you ever notice that they say that doctors practice medicine? They don't master it, they practice it. Who are they practicing it on? They're practicing it on us. Like, it's guesswork in a white coat. Like, like they
Hmm.
don't, but at the same time, people need care. And the fact that so many private doctors' offices and therapy offices and specialty offices are not accessible to people. And I'm not just talking about, we have a ramp, we have, our bathrooms are accessible. I'm talking about, can you get somebody out of their chair and weigh them? Because you're not getting a correct weight. If they're telling you, oh, my chair is about 27 pounds, and you're just subtracting 27 pounds off of it, you could be missing things that way. There are things that you can't assess on someone unless you can put them on an exam table. And if you can't do that, then it's not an accommodating place. It's not a place, and it is a place of public accommodation. That's what's so aggravating, is that, we fought and won this war in 1990 with the Americans with Disabilities Act, that said that all places of public accommodation, places where everybody can go, need to be accessible, including doctors' offices. And yet they're not. And they always have an excuse, oh, we were grandfathered in. Oh, we took a tax break on the other thing. There's always an excuse, but it's an excuse that lands on the backs of people who need care. And
Mhm.
the fact that so many doctors don't know what to do with someone who comes in with a disability. I mean, doctors, I have a friend on Facebook who has spinal muscular atrophy, and she's pregnant, and of course she's a high risk pregnancy, but the doctors she was running into that are just like, what do you mean? Like, almost like, first of all, why were you having sex? And that's a whole other I could go on a whole other hour about infantilizing people with disabilities and treating them like children and not seeing them as sex objects. Well, I'll leave that over here. But forget about that. They had never even, the concept of trying to, what do you mean? Like, you're pregnant? Like, how is this going to work? Well, dude, you're the doctor. You tell me. Like, you're supposed to be telling me how this works. And the fact that so many people, so many doctors are so ill equipped to handle something complicated, like a pregnancy and a disability. Did you think that wouldn't be that hard? Right. Like, or
Mhm.
I have MS and I also have allergies. Why is this a thing? Like, what, like, everything. I just feel like it's, not only is it not accommodating, many times physically accommodating, you can't get in the place, but on top of it, they don't know how to handle and talk to people with disabilities. I mean, I think that disability etiquette is a thing that, doctors' offices and hospitals really need to work on, because you can't be talking to somebody, using a wheelchair. Hi, honey, how are you? While I'm 35 years old and I really don't want to sound like a child, actually, like, like I, it does make me, it's frustrating because so many people don't even see an issue. They don't see ableism,
Mhm.
which is, rampant. It's everywhere. So it's the fact that I do see it, I feel like I have this terrible superpower where I'm just like, that's ableist. And people are like, what even is ableism? I'm like, no, do I have to start from there? Like, don't like it.
No, like you said earlier, you said what, 1 in 5 people have a
Yes,
disability. So
yes.
like that's a large part of the population. So they need to be doing better. They need to know how to handle these situations. Like it's not it's ridiculous is what it is.
It is, and it's frustrating when I hear, my members, talking about their doctors that are, I go to this doctor and I don't like what he's saying these things, like he doesn't want to do this, he doesn't want to do that. I'm like, look, you can't. We live right outside of Philly. You can't swing a cat without hitting a doctor around here. Like, leave. He
Mhm.
doesn't deserve your money or your time. Like, I I mean, I feel a lot worse for people who live in rural areas who don't have the same resources to getting, services. But, when you have them and you have the ability to just change doctors, why would you stay? And most of the answers I get are like, oh, well, I've been with him for years. I don't want to hurt his feelings. So you want to not hurt someone's feelings that you see twice a year so that you can suffer every day until you see him again and he still doesn't do it? It makes me it does make me crazy, because I think doctors are immediately given a respect that they do not necessarily deserve. I think people don't know how to assess their own care. I think they're just, a lot of people, especially older people, but not all older people. I mean, a lot of people have, like I said, cognitive issues or
Mhm.
memory issues, or or processing issues or executive function issues, making like, and to to make things, this all makes things so much more difficult, and it makes me crazy because the medical community is where so many people with medical conditions and disabilities have to go, and yet it's the place where so many people find the most frustration. It really
Mhm.
is, like, I think it's probably the number one, you know issue I hear about is insurance and medical stuff, is that people just I tried to do this, I couldn't get that, this doctor couldn't do the other, there's a referral thing, the insurance won't do that, like it's constant, and nobody can guide you through that unless you hire someone to guide you through that.
Mm-hmm. And even
Whole
like you
thing.
mentioned, when you were 16, you started with problems with the healthcare system when they didn't really want to listen to what you had to say about
Exactly.
how your body was feeling.
Exactly. And because
So,
part of that was because I was young, but another part of it is because I was female, I believe,
hmm
and yeah, as far back as that, the issues with the medical community, it's amazing how dismissive some doctors can be. And I had to go through a lot of neurologists before I found mine, and I always tell people in my group, that if you don't feel comfortable telling someone that you need something or you want something, how can you be comfortable enough with them to tell them when you're in pain? How can you be comfortable? You can't trust that person if they're clearly not paying attention to you. So why are you there? Like, I when I finally found my doctor, I mean, one of the things that I really liked the most about him was not only was he listening to me, really, listening to what I was saying, to the words that were coming out of my mouth and writing them down, but he was asking appropriate questions and he explains things to me in a way that doesn't make me feel like either an idiot
hmm
or like over my head. I'll say something to him like, oh, I was thinking, what do you think about maybe me trying whatever or this medication or something? And he might say, some doctors might say, oh, I don't want that for you, and that's it, that's your answer.
hmm
This doctor says, okay, well, you know what, I don't think so, but here's why. And he'll say, you're on this medication and I'm a little worried, or like you have this symptom and it might make this worse. He'll explain it to you, and that to me is a sign of a good doctor, is that somebody who will not just listen to you but also help you process things and work with you as if you are a team member in your own care, which you are. You're
hmm
supposed to be the captain. you know they're not leading the team, you're leading the team. They're supposed to just be members of your team. Make me
Which
crazy.
exactly, it sounds like the bare minimum. Like when you explain it
Right.
like that, like I want a doctor that listens to what I have to say, how I'm feeling, and explains it to me. But just, I feel like I've been to so many doctors that it's like they just try and push you in and try and get you out as fast as
Oh
they
yeah,
can.
it's like the
And
quickest.
it's just like I just want the bare minimum. Like let's have a conversation about my health. Like
Yeah.
you said, I'm the captain. Just listen to what I actually have to say about my body.
Yes, and I'm not a I mean I'm I'm not a terribly forceful personality, to be honest. I mean, if a doctor, I'm not generally going to be like, oh, get all up in their face. But if I find somebody to
hmm
be rude or inappropriate, I will light you up. I have no problem. I, I had a doctor that I went into, and I was having a problem. I believe it was a problem with my knee. And I went in and he didn't even look at me. He walked in with his head down on the iPad or whatever he was doing. And he's like, so what do you need? You want this? You need the other? I'm like, I need you to kind of look at me though. Like, that's what I said. Yeah. And he looked up and like annoyed like this. And I was like, okay. I'm like, hi. And I gave him my situation, and, he kind of, I said, he didn't even look at my knee. Like, he was just like, well, what are you looking for? I'll give you this medication. And I was like, no, I don't think that's necessary. I don't think I need to finish this visit. I said, so I just got up and I left. And he was like, well, you can't just leave. I'm like, why? I'm like, I don't like your attitude. I don't like what you're doing. Like, so you got my $15 and whatever from my insurance. I'm leaving. Like, what? You're not a good doctor. Like,
hmm
I have my moments where I'm just like, I can't take it. Like I get aggravated, and then I tell myself, Amy, just center your chakras, relax, find peace somehow, because you can't be lighting up doctors all the time.
And you just have to find the right provider and care for you.
Exactly. Yes.
Yes.
And you need to know what you need is the other thing.
hmm
Like I went through a bunch of doctors before I realized, oh, I can't have somebody who, is too egotistical, who's very much like, this is how we're doing it. Well, but no, we're not. I mean, it's like an opinion. I yeah, I just feel like the whole system is kind of broken. But again, that's a whole other conversation and might get political, so we won't go into that.
Well, Thank you for sharing all of that because we're all about patient advocacy. So it's great to hear that people are fighting, I guess, for their right in their doctor's offices. Um, Even though we shouldn't have to fight. But
No. Yeah.
so you started mentioning earlier about the stigma surrounding disabilities. How can we help fight the stigma surrounding people with disabilities and be allies and advocates for them?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, for starters, I mean, you know, it's the simple stuff, it's making no assumptions, what somebody can or cannot, do. If somebody can or cannot speak, somebody can or cannot, do anything. It's about, you know, understanding that anybody could be disabled. And I think that's what I think people have been kind of, trained, brainwashed, kind of to from very young to look at people with disabilities as something to be sorry about or for, that it's inherently a bad thing. Like it's a capital B bad word, disability, like you don't want it, and that seeps into your subconscious, whether, you know it or not, beginning with children, and I think most people with disabilities don't mind questions, that come from children. They don't really mind how they come out. They don't mind. But what can be problematic with children is the way the parents react. Somebody's, who says, okay, well, don't look over there and don't point at them and no, don't ask. And, it makes it, that's inherently something I shouldn't be doing. It must be something, bad, something bad must have happened to that person. I think, I grew up with both of my parents are registered nurses. And I remember the first time I saw someone in a wheelchair, I was in the hospital where my father worked. And I said to my mother, what happened to that man's legs? And she said, I don't know. Why don't you go ask him? I said, all right. And I went over there and he gave me some terrible answer too. He told me something like, I ate too many Frosted Flakes and they took my legs off. So which I realized later on means he was probably diabetic, but I was like, you ate too many and they came off? I was like, that's terrible. But I mean, that kind of attitude, towards someone with a disability is, like that's a person, I don't know, you can ask him, you don't have to, like it. And if you do, I mean, you don't lead with it. I mean, it's nobody's business, and I don't think everybody should have to act as a teacher all the time. I don't want to have to be everybody's life coach around disability just when I'm out doing my living my life, just like most people don't. But at the same time, you know the other question I always ask people, I wanted to ask her what's wrong with her, and I say, well, why? What would you have gleaned from that? Like, what are you getting out of that? Because that's clearly a question for you. It doesn't tell you anything about who they are. It doesn't tell you anything about them at all, but it's important to you for some reason. I always liken it to transgender, folks who are like, they get the same kind of treatment where it's like, it's all about like, oh, when can I ask you about what's between your legs, or surgery, like, that's why. What do you want to know that for? Like, unless you're dating them, there's really no reason to know that. So I think just generally, understanding that a disability is something that can happen to anyone and will, if you just are old enough. Everybody's going to be disabled if you live long enough to get there. And I think that helps. It also helps for people to know a little bit of disability etiquette. I think for some people, they're afraid of being, well, first of all, they're afraid that what they're going to say isn't going to be misconstrued or as pity, or something like that. But I think they're also afraid of being embarrassed. People are afraid that, maybe they'll go to somebody and they won't understand what they're saying. Maybe somebody has a speech impediment or has a communication disorder, and I used to do a presentation, like an etiquette presentation, where I used to remind people, I'm like, if you're talking to somebody with a disability who's hard to understand, you're not going to hurt their feelings. They know they're hard to understand. They know that. If you ask them to repeat them, they'd rather you ask them to repeat themselves 5 times, than just go, oh, okay, and nod your head and not really know what they're talking about, because that's just disrespectful. That's like not listening to what they're saying. And I think that, it helps too for people to know your own boundaries, and people are also afraid of, oh, if I get involved with this, if I date this person or I get involved with this person, with a disability, I'm going to end up, being their caregiver, and I'm going to, you set your limits. I mean, and again, that's up to somebody who needs to have good boundaries. You say, look, I'm not comfortable, helping you in the bathroom, but I'm comfortable in the restaurant, helping you eat the food, that you can set your own boundaries. That's healthy. You should do that. And you can't get sucked into something you don't want to do, if you have them. But yeah, I think that just generally speaking, being a good advocate is it's also it's just really about treating people. It sounds so cliche, treating people how you think how you'd treat anybody else, not even how you'd want to be treated, because I think when you put it that way, it kind of like triggers something in people, like, oh, I can't be in that place, that can't be me. Like it's almost like a recoiling. So I never say like that could be you. I say, that could be your brother, that could be your whoever's important to them, fill in the blank. And it totally could. Right now somebody could get into a car accident and be in a very similar situation. Yeah, so it's just knowing that it could be someone you love, and how would you treat them? Would you treat them differently? You probably wouldn't. You treat them
Hmm.
as whoever, Rick. You're just Rick.
I think
Remember that
that's a great,
they're just John, they're just Amy, they're just that person. Yeah,
yeah. And I think that's a great mindset and a great way to put it because, like you said, people don't want to put themselves in that shoes. So think of somebody else that you love. And it
right.
changes your whole perspective of how, like, you're good. You think you should interact with somebody who has a disability.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. And it's the terminology too, like some of the words we use, especially with kids, we say things like special needs, they don't have special needs. They have the same needs as everybody else. They just get them filled in a different way. Like it makes them sound like they're out from outer space or something. Like, they have these special needs, they have to be watered. Don't put the water on them after midnight. Don't feed them like gremlins or something. Like special needs, you know, makes me crazy. Yeah, so I mean, sometimes I think that the terminology and the way you phrase things, like I heard somebody say, well, she couldn't get into the building because of her wheelchair. No, that is incorrect. She couldn't get into the building because the building wasn't accessible. She couldn't get into the building because of the building, not because
mhm.
of her disability. You know, and the fact that you know so many things could be built in a more universal design, where, I mean, ramps, you think about it, like people think, oh, ramps for people with disabilities. Well, yes, but ramps are also for people with strollers and crutches and a shopping cart, and a walker, and I mean, or people who can't lift their knee up too high because it hurts. Like, it when you make things easier for people with disabilities, you almost by default make it easier for everyone else. Like doorknobs, the difference between having a doorknob like round and turns like this and one of the flat doorknobs that goes like this, most people wouldn't kind of think of that. But you can't grab something if you don't have that kind of strength and control, but you can always usually just kind of put your hand down and open something. That's a way of making something more accessible. I probably just came off of your question entirely, I'm sorry.
Oh no, you're fine. I love what you're saying.
Yeah, so it's, yeah, like I said, I could go on all the time. I just go off. So feel free to stop me at any time.
No, I mean, you present great points, and it's just like kind of we isolate the disability community.
Hmm.
And I think that, like you said, with the ramps and the doorknobs and that kind of thing, like they're still part of the greater whole. Like, why do
Yeah,
we have to act like they are not, I guess?
yeah, they're different somehow.
Yeah.
Different animal. Yeah, and they're not. I mean, and people. I mean, a lot of people are walking around with invisible disabilities too. I mean, up until the time that I started using my cane all the time. I use the cane now almost all the time when I'm out. I don't really need it kind of in the house. Um, but oh, I'm sorry. See, again, lost my train of thought really
Oh no,
quickly.
you're good. You're good.
What was I saying?
In invisible disabilities, you were talking about that.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, when you have invisible disabilities, sometimes it's things like, I can't have everything's too loud, like I need things to be a little quieter. Somebody might have a handicap placard, and they look like they're fine, but they have a cardiac condition or a respiratory condition. That's something that's still a life-altering disability. I mean, by anybody's definition. And I think a lot of people who have any kind of medical condition would do well to at least learn the basics of the ADA, because it really can come in handy. It really to say like, oh, this should be this way and this should be that way, especially in terms of employment and things. But yeah, so like invisible disabilities is a whole other thing. But again, like, somebody with a hearing impairment, that's an easy accessibility change to make if you're in a movie theater or if you're in a regular theater. Like, it's cheap, and so many things can be made accessible. I think I learned when I was on taking like the ADA coordinators class, I think it is. Um, I learned that most accommodations for businesses for people with disabilities can be done for less than $500. Because sometimes it really is just a matter of you need something to go over that lip on the door, but sometimes it really is just a matter of getting a closed captioning system, and that's relatively cheap. So, but often places of public accommodation will say, well, we don't have any people with disabilities that come in here. Well, do you think it's because you're inaccessible, or do you think it's because they don't exist? Like, that hello, no, nobody comes in here with a disability. I can't imagine why. It's so accommodating and welcoming. Like, what? I don't know. So I mean, because people with disabilities have so long also been out of the public eye, up until 1950 or so. I mean, people were being kept in basements and institutions, and people see a wheelchair as a they say like I'm confined, to a wheelchair. That's a freeing device. Without them, people would be in bed. That's not you know. I'm going to keep going on, but I'm going to stop now because I was happening. It's enough.
No, everything you're saying is great, and it just brings in new perspective entirely. And like you said, with like invisible disabilities, we have no idea what somebody is going through. So we're very quick to judge.
Yes.
And that's frustrating
Yeah.
because I mean, I'll move on.
I don't want to use up all your next 45 minutes slot.
You're fine. Um, so what do you wish more people knew about MS?
Hmm. Well, that it is different for everyone. That it can be different for the same person day by day too. Um, you know, People will say, how you feeling? Oh, I feel fine, and maybe an hour later I don't feel so fine, and maybe 2 hours later I feel a little better. And it it's so different, and it's so I think it's so kind of mysterious. People, even the medical community doesn't really know what's going on with most of the autoimmune conditions. They don't really know why it starts. They don't really know what to do with it. They're not even really working towards a cure. They're working towards, with MS in slowing down progression, but not reversing damage. So it's permanent, and it fluctuates both. It never goes away, but it can get a little better. MS isn't something you can catch. It's also generally not something that is inherited from, in families. Although, again, because we don't know everything about it, there do seem to be some families that do have that running on the mother's side of the family. It's rare, but you see my sister has it, my mother had it, that, and it does tend to be, from what I understand, in more Black families, tends to like it tends to be a little worse in that, with that familial one. So again, they're looking for all of these kind of links. But yeah, MS, it can't be cured, very simply with one thing. Don't send me emails about diets, and I'm sure like these things might help some people, but it's not nothing's curing anyone of anything. And I always try to tell people that do have MS and other conditions, be careful where you're getting information from too, because some of the information you can get can like not be real information. But yeah, living with MS it's like anything else. It's like living with any condition. You get used to it, but unfortunately, with this condition, you get used to it, and then something else happens, and then you get used to that. You get used to
Hmm.
that plateau, and then something else happens, and you get used to that. And I mean, we're humans, and we are infinitely flexible. Almost, people. The most horrible things can happen to people, and they can still come out of it, and survive it. I mean, you always think I would hate if this ever happened. I'd never be able to live. If I was ever in an accident, I ever broke my neck and I was in a wheelchair, I wouldn't want to live. Well, talk to me again when and if it happens, but it's, yeah, it's, I just, I wish people would learn more about what different kinds of disabilities are, not just MS, too, would kind of understand more that you're not the default. People, I often think, they always, oh well, if I was this person, I would have done XYZ. Well, you're not that person, you're you. And you're not coming at it from XYZ's perspective because they're them. A lot of it just has to do with, just be flexible. That's another thing with people with disabilities and MS and chronic illness. Just try to be flexible. We're doing our best for the most part. And we're sometimes things have to be flexed out, and it's great to have friends that understand that too. And that's why I always encourage people to, join support groups, or, be with people that have the same condition, because nobody's going to get you like them. I can say, I have friends that I can say I've made all these plans with, and I'll say, oh, I'm so sorry, I had to cancel. You never have to be sorry with us, like that's, and there's a term for that too, in disability world, call it um intimacy connection, I believe, or no, I'm sorry, accessibility intimacy. And it's when you feel comfortable enough with someone to tell them exactly what you need, what kind of help you need, to not have to not be afraid to say, what, guys, I'm sorry, I can't go to that restaurant because their lighting is too bad for me with my visual impairment, or whatever. That's, yeah, that's sorry.
And
I
no,
went
you're good. You're fine. That is all great advice, and everybody should learn more about these disabilities and MS and other disorders like that, like you said, so that we are able to advocate for people with disabilities and be allies with them and not treat them like outsiders. Um,
Yeah, yeah, because they are, I mean, people with disabilities are, and people with any, medical conditions are just people, and they're just doing the best they can do.
exactly.
Yeah,
And that concludes our interview for today. So again, this is Taklif. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your story. You have such an amazing perspective and brought such great knowledge to this interview. So thank you so much. And thank you for teaching us the best way to be an ally and advocate for people with disabilities. So we hope the best for you and your health.
thank you.
And if you're interested in setting up an interview with us, please reach out with your name and email address to set up an interview. Email me at powerofpatient@gmail.com. I'm Bri Allison for the Power of the Patient Project, the National Library of Patient Rights and Advocacy. Thank you for watching.